Hunting deer in wolf country. That's what this video is about. Hello everybody, this is Nathan Nelson with Stillwater Outdoors. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about some of the patterns and behaviors of wolves and deer and how they interact and how we can use that to our advantage to put ourselves in a good spot for hunting season. The state of Wisconsin has a population of wolves that is growing at a very fast rate. The DNR has released some of their statistics on this, and they project that the population is over about 1,000 right now. Now, I've got a buddy in my area that does a lot of calling for coyotes, and one of the things that he told me recently that just blew my mind was that for every coyote that he calls in, his calls will bring in 4 or 5 wolves. So that tells you that we do have a very strong population of wolves in our area when he's seeing that many more wolves than he is coyotes. So I've got 9 points that I want to go through, and I may add in a few little extras here. But the first one that I want to talk about is that wolves generally will avoid wet areas. Now, this is not like a set in stone thing. It's not like it's always this way. There's never always when we're talking wild animals in the woods. In the Voyageurs Wolf Project, they did a survey with GPS collars on wolves, and they tracked their movements. And if you notice looking at this map of the wolf's movements, there's certain blocks of areas where these wolves just don't really seem to go into very much. And the reason why, as what they said in the comments, is that these are marsh areas or wet areas, and the wolves just don't really seem to want to go wade through that stuff. So, if you know of a deer and he's living in an area where there's a good wetland area, a good swamp, a good marsh, that could be a good place to key in on him where he might spend more of his daylight hours because he doesn't get as much hunting pressure when he's there. Once those marshes and swamps and wet areas freeze, they're fair game for the wolves, and you'll notice that the wolves will start to travel in and through those areas much more freely. Generally, the deer will not stay in those wet areas once it freezes. So an example is that one time I went out to a marsh, and there was this island that had all the features, all the right things that I was looking for in a buck bedding area. Got out there in the middle of winter when there's a lot of snow, everything's frozen. And I got out to the point, and there was scads of wolf tracks everywhere. Oftentimes when these wolves can get into these areas, they make it so that the deer just don't really want to be with that hassle. So I didn't find any good deer sign in that area. So when you find a wet area, try to key in on those areas before there's any, freezing that goes on. Get in there when it's still wet, and then you'll probably have a better chance at actually targeting a mature deer. The second point that I wanted to make is if you also look at that same map by Voyageurs Wolf Project, you'll also see that wolves are very territorial. Look at the lines and how they'll come right up next to each other, but they don't cross into that other zone very much. And usually the reason behind that is because if they cross over, then they might get into a fight and one of the wolves might die. So it's more of a survival thing than anything else. But it does make this really unique situation where there's not quite as much hunting pressure in and around those territory zones for the wolves. So if you're a deer hunter, one of the things that if you can somehow get knowledge of, or maybe through your observations in the woods, or if your county releases GPS collar studies on wolves, you could get a little bit of an idea of where the wolf packs border, and then you could go in and try to hunt that area, and you'll probably find that there's a better population of deer in those areas because the wolves don't go to those fringes as much to hunt. Another thing that's really important is that you've got to cover more ground. When you're in wolf country, the deer numbers are not going to be like they are in farm country. Usually in the big woods, we're talking anywhere from 4 to maybe 8 deer per square mile, unless you get into like some managed areas where people have property, and then you'll get a little bit more than that. But for the most part, it is very low deer densities. So if you're going to hunt for deer in a wolf country area, you need to cover a lot of ground. You need to walk a lot of miles. You need to put a lot of miles on your boots in the spring and even during the hunting season. So my fourth point is that I've noticed that oftentimes the big mature deer that survive, they are deer that have found everything that they need to survive. They've got the best vantage point, they've got the best cover, they've got the best food, they've got everything that works in their advantage so that the wolves can't get close enough to them. So now if you combine that with my previous point that you need to cover a lot of ground, that's going to help you put yourself in the right place so that you can find a high odds bedding area. Otherwise, you're just going to be kind of guessing as to where that deer would be bedding. So you got to get out, you got to cover ground, you got to find those high odds area where a deer has learned to survive. This leads into my fifth point. You have to have several deer every year that you're going to be hunting. If you're in wolf country, there is a chance that at any point in time, your target deer could get killed by a wolf. You could lose that deer, and then if you're not keyed in on any other deer, you have no backups or any other options, you're going to be sitting there scratching your head the entire rest of that season trying to catch up with another deer. So make sure that you have several deer that you have on your hit list that you could target at any time during the season. Point number 6, during the winter, wolves are very nomadic within their home range. And one of the things that has really been helpful for the wolves is that we have road systems now. We've got back roads everywhere. And so what this does for the wolves is it makes traveling very easy for them. They can cover miles and miles and miles and hardly have to exert any energy. In the past, before settlement, there was a higher wolf population. According to the DNR, they say there was 4,500 wolves. But those wolves did not have road systems to travel and cover a lot of ground with. So if they were going to go anywhere in the deep snow in the winter, they would literally have to blaze a trail. They'd have to walk through the deep snow, and that takes away a huge advantage for them because now they're on the same playing field as every deer out in the woods. So what this means for us as hunters is that sometimes we may have to get a little bit further back in the woods, find some areas that might not be tapped into quite as much, an area that might be a little bit more challenging for a wolf to get into, and there you might find some better deer sign. Another thing that could be really helpful to know here on my 7th point is where the dens are for these wolves. Now, I have personally not been able to really figure this out when I've been out in the woods, but there are some people that know exactly where the wolves are denning up, especially if they're doing this in the summer, because as I said earlier, in the winter they're more nomadic. They're going to travel more, so they're going to cover more ground and take out deer throughout their whole entire range. But during the summer, the pups are there, they're growing, and they need food. So oftentimes they're going to hunt in and around that den area. So you might notice that areas that are closer to a den, that's going to be your lowest deer densities, your worst chance to find a mature buck. And oftentimes it's not that the bucks can't survive in these areas. It's just that when they're young or when they're fawns, they get taken out. So if your fawn crop is being taken out every year, you're just going to have right off the bat less deer that have a chance to even get to the next year to reach maturity. Now, in my own trail camera surveys of the deer herd on my property as well as on public land, one of the things that I have seen is that we have about 15 to maybe 25% fawn retention. The very first year that I owned my property, I had 5 mature does, and there was 2 fawns between all 5 of them. And oftentimes, these does should have 2 fawns. So there's just this really low chance of survival, and that's not all due just to wolves. I mean, we've got predators out the yin-yang up here. All that to say, if you're near a den area, your chance of having fawns make it into older age classes is going to be lower right off the bat. So my 8th point is that one of the best strategies that you can have in hunting in wolf country is to go in areas where the wolves don't usually spend as much time. And one of the areas that wolves don't usually like to spend a lot of time in is in and around houses, and they also don't really like to be up near busy roads. Now, this is not always the case, but for the most part, you're not going to find wolves hanging out very much around areas where there's human activity. They just don't seem to like being around humans as much. So that could be a really good strategy for you as a hunter to key in on areas where the wolves are not spending time. My 9th point is that you got to pray for the snow to stay soft for the deer during the winter. If you get that crust layer of snow, like you get some snow and then it rains on it or it melts and it gets really hard and crusty, and then you get snow on top of that, what can happen is that this crust layer is not firm enough that the deer punch right through it, so they can't stay on top of it. But the wolves, they got these big pads, and they can stay right up on top of that crust layer, and they can just cruise and run and just run these deer right down because they don't have to plow through quite as much snow. So if you're a deer hunter and you want the deer numbers to stay high, you pray for no crust layers on the snow. So now I want to give you guys a few bonus tips for hunting in wolf country. The first one is that a friend of mine in my area who's a very successful hunter, one of the things that he told me is that he notices oftentimes that when it's windy out, the deer will get up on their feet a little bit more in daylight in wolf country. And he says that he thinks that the wolves kind of get the deer antsy a little bit, especially on those windy days, because all of a sudden the deer has lost 2 of their senses. They can't hear very well and they can't see as well because you've got all the movement from everything. So they kind of get nervous, and he says that they get up on their feet a little bit more. He's got a bunch of trail camera data to show that they get up on their feet a little bit more on those days. So if you're hunting, try to key in on those days a little bit more than not. And if you've got a deer that's on trail camera and you know he's coming through and all of a sudden it's a really windy day, that might be the day to target him. So my final tip for you guys is that the DNR has been doing collar research studies on wolves for many years. In fact, I've gotten trail camera pictures of wolves that have collars on them. So I know in my area that they're tracking and tracing and following these different wolf packs. And where this could be beneficial for you is that you'll get the chance to learn about what the wolves are doing in your county. So maybe your county releases information on the GPS collar studies through the DNR website, or maybe it just be through striking up a conversation with a DNR officer and just see if you can glean some understanding and some wisdom about what the wolf patterns are in your area, and maybe that will help you to get after some big bucks. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Be sure to put a comment down below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say.